To undertake such a trip obviously demanded a considerable investment, not only of money but also of faith and trust, and on the face of it the entire enterprise would appear to be crackpot and incredibly presumptuous. But the management said it was necessary, so off the three went from New York to Helsinki, then to Warsaw, Ankara, Tehran, Moscow and back via Copenhagen, where they were assured that their mission had been a success. In explaining their strategy of psychic influence, the communicator showed a shrewd insight into the Russian mind. They said, it is an emotional mind. But with great love and strong meditation a simple mind may be made to feel, and then in turn come to some sense. There is a difference between a simple mind that thinks it is intelligent and a simple mind that is simple in ignorance and with emotion. The Russian leaders are more emotional, and with meditation and strong prayer and a link with all, we can work on the emotion to stabilize it. The problem with Russia has always been the emotion. That's not a bad assessment for an extraterrestrial. So the quixotic travelers completed their journey, but they had no way of knowing for certain that their money and faith had been well invested, for at the start they had only the management's word for it that a crisis was imminent, and at the end they only had the management's assurance that they had been instrumental in averting it. However, it is perhaps relevant to recall that there is a meditation room in the United Nations building in New York, and also that the great modern Indian saint, Sri Aurobindo, a man of no mean intellectual capacity, claimed that the strengthening of the Russian resistance during the siege of Stalingrad was due to the power he generated through meditation. The idea of psychic influence on world events is not exclusive to our extraterrestrial friends and their Ossining confederates. I have mentioned the 1974 Middle East adventure as an example of an action initiated by the communicators. There are other types of such actions, or rather programs, for work in these several areas is continuing. There are investigations of children who can produce the Geller effect of bending metal, there is work with psychic healers, and there is a research program involving dolphins and porpoises, aquatic superminds also allegedly in service with the management. The work of the community and their associates ramifies in many directions and involves activities all over the world, some of which have been topics of public attention and debate over recent years. To pursue the ramifications of their story is to see emerge a portrait of an age, our age, a portrait in which are delineated its deepest concerns, its discoveries and adventures, its fears, hopes, longings, and yes, perhaps also its follies. Even if the questions of the provenance, the authenticity and the veridical content of the communications were put aside, the story would be worth telling just because it focuses and interrelates aspects of the emergent new consciousness of this end quarter of the 20th century. But in the end the most exciting part of the story is the part that is most contentious, dubious, and hard to swallow. When the parapsychological and socio-cultural aspects of the case have been thoroughly explored, there remains to be considered the question whether the communications can conceivably be what they purport to be. Is there even a remote possibility that our planet has long been under the surveillance and occasionally under the direct influence of intelligent forces from some other part of the cosmos? To do the communications justice, we have to venture into this area where speculation is rife and hard facts are difficult to come by. There is a vast literature about UFOs and extraterrestrial visitors to our planet, and to judge by the success of the books of Eric von Daniken, Pauls and Bergier, and Brinsley Le Patrenche, there is a large public avid to believe in the existence of the space gods. The unscholarly and wildly conjectural approach adopted in most of the UFO literature has tended to polarize attitudes towards uncritical belief on the one hand and total rejection of the possibilities on the other. Rational men who want no truck with the lunatic fringe can scarcely be prevailed upon rationally to consider such evidence as there is for the existence and activities of extraterrestrials. Some may go as far as Carl Jung went in his 1947 essay, Flying Saucers, and concede that UFOs have a kind of objective existence as psychic exteriorization phenomena, and that the worldwide sightings of them over recent decades are symptomatic of a wave of hope in the reappearance of Christ. Religions, of course, have always taught the existence of a supramundane intelligence and divine intervention in human affairs and history, so the idea is not unfamiliar. And if we take a look beyond the popular literature and the scholarly acrimony it has engendered, and shelf the plausible Jungian hypothesis for a time, we find that a surprising number of people who are in a position to be better informed than most do not find the idea of the existence and interventions of extraterrestrials inherently implausible. When I had listened to the first batch of tapes and had begun to take seriously the possibility of venturing upon the present book, I sought through books immediately to hand in my own modest library and within half an hour turned up a number of facts that began to erode my basic skepticism about extraterrestrials. I found, for instance, that in 1971 an international conference, sponsored jointly by the American and Russian Academies of Science, had been convened in Armenia and had launched Project Cyclops, an international research project on the practical possibilities and foreseeable consequences of establishing contact with extraterrestrial beings. The following year a symposium entitled Life Beyond Earth and the Mind of Man was organized by Professor Richard Berenzon of Boston University. Professor Berenzon, an astronomer, stated that recent developments in the sciences strongly indicate the high probability of the existence of extraterrestrial life. He had also suggested, I learned, that an effective way of communicating with extraterrestrials might be through psychic channels. And in a book co-authored by Professor Carl Sagan of Cornell and Professor Joseph Shklovsky of Moscow University, entitled Intelligent Life in the Universe, the suggestion is put forward that the ancient Sumerians may have had contact with the space people. The researches of the philosopher-mathematician Dr. Charles Muses into ancient mythology and symbolism point to the same conclusion. Furthermore, the sober calculations of astrophysicists and exobiologists of the possibilities of the existence of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe are staggering. Dr. Frank Drake of Cornell estimates that 1 in 10 million stars possesses a detectable civilization. This modest figure would yield a total of between 100,000 and a million in our galaxy alone. That a proportion of these should be older and technologically more advanced civilizations than ours is a possibility that can hardly be dismissed out of hand without incurring a charge of narrow-minded planetary chauvinism. Our own space technology is barely 15 years old, and the Apollo project of landing men on the moon was accomplished within 6 years of its inception, so who is to say that other civilizations possessed of eons of technological expertise in advance of ours might not exist and long ago have conquered interstellar space and evolved technologies beyond the boldest imaginings of our scientists and science fiction writers? These were some of the facts and arguments that disposed me to take more seriously than I had on the day I first visited Ossining the idea that the communications may not be fraud, delusion, or a parapsychological phenomenon but precisely what John and Andrea believed them to be, messages from the space people. I could think of a score of reasons why the proposition was absurd, but if there was the remotest possibility that it might be true, it was obviously worth investigating the evidence more deeply. When I accepted the invitation to be the chronicler of the Ossining Group's adventure, I confess that just for a moment I entertained the thought that it would be stupid to pass up a possible opportunity to be a witness to a new apocalypse. But I suppressed the thought no sooner than it surfaced, well aware that of all the tutelary spirits I could choose to accompany me on this particular venture, the most inappropriate would be those that bore the names Faith and Hope. Since the above pages were written 9 months have elapsed, I have listened to the recordings of all the communications, participated in some myself, and completed this book, and I would now like to add a few pages to this introductory chapter in the light of these experiences. I was apprehensive, when I embarked on this book, that I might reach a point where I could no longer continue with the work. It was possible that when I had heard more of the material and had analyzed it and thought about it, I would become convinced that a perfectly normal, or what I have called a normally paranormal explanation of it could be plausibly adduced, in which case I would be obliged by the ethics of intellectual integrity to wield Occam's razor and cut out all extravagant hypotheses such as the existence of extraterrestrials. But this hasn't happened. Increasing familiarity with the material of the communications and with the people involved has only consolidated my feeling that this is one of the most remarkable true stories that any writer ever had dropped into his lap, and also increased my puzzlement as to where the communications could emanate from if not from the alleged extraterrestrial intelligence. When I first visited Ossining and John said with a laugh that he wondered whether my appearance at that time was as casual as it seemed and whether the management might not have a plan to use me in some way, I frankly thought him crackers. But when I listened to the tapes I understood why the thought might have occurred to him. 2 days before I visited Ossining, in fact on the very day that I arrived in New York and before I had contacted John, he and Andrea were told in a communication, there will be those that will come to you this weekend that will be of benefit. There will be a time when they will walk away moving their heads back and forth and will not understand. But then they will sit and they will think and they will have an experience and they will begin to understand. And then they will work with you. We have decided that those that work with you must begin to have experiences for them to have understanding. There are not many in your physical world that operate on faith as you do, Sir John. When I asked John whether anyone else had visited Ossining that weekend, he couldn't recall whether anyone had, but he was certain that no one had visited who had later become involved in the work. He had quite forgotten about the prediction in the communication held on the Friday, But when I drew his attention to it, he said, "I'm sure that was intended for you." Well, maybe. After listening through all the tapes, I have become inured to the shock of seeing an extraordinary prediction fulfilled.